Okay, we are going to get started. So thank you for coming. And here we have Chuck Hechel and Macho Cartagena, and they work for Ed Plus Success Coaching Center, and primary roles include data analyst, reporting, tech support, and everything. So without further ado.
Thank you, Sherry. My name again, it's Chuck Hechel. I'm a senior project manager of information technology, and I've been in the role for about 3 years. I've been with Ed Plus for 6, so I'm still relatively new on the data side. I was doing coaching and financial aid prior to that, but the data is a lot more interesting in my opinion.
I'm Macho Cartagena. I am the project coordinator for the Ed Plus Success Coaching Center. I've been at Ed Plus for about 3.5 years, as a success coach for 2.5, and in the data role for about a year now. Since this is kind of a nice little Lego theme, we kind of figured to go with our favorite Lego moment. My favorite Lego moment is not so pleasant. It's usually stepping on a Lego. I have 3 kids, so my son loves to play with Legos, so stepping on them is the most. What about you, Chuck?
Good question. I also have 3 kids. I'm probably the largest of them. But my favorite Lego moment is, as a child, I would look at the catalogs and see that Lego Death Star out there. I don't know if anyone's familiar with that. And I always wanted it, but I could never have it as a kid. So an opportunity came up where my youngest child was not staying on track with school and other things he needed to. And I thought, this is my chance. So I said, wife, I used her name. I think what we can do is motivate him by getting the Lego Death Star. And then when he's doing well for a while, he can get the next stage. And for some reason, she agreed. So I finally got to put together the Lego Death Star. I had help. Eventually, when he moves out, I'm going to take it apart and do it by myself. But that was pretty fun for me. Yeah, so thanks everyone for being here. What we're going to talk about is how we support the online success coaches. And what we do is we create proactive instances for them to reach out to students so they can support students and help them through to graduation. So we do this through using Salesforce cases. We create Salesforce cases depending on what's happening with the student at the moment. So we're going to talk about that. Actually, Macho's going to talk about that. And then I'm going to be going into a technical deep dive about how we create these Salesforce cases using Alteryx. And then we'll open it up to any questions at the end.
Being with, Jira tickets as a project coordinator and just kind of keeping track of things, it's kind of the who, the what, and the why we do things. So we roughly, each coach supports about 850 students, and we have about 120 coaches and leads in the department. And it's important because it's a coach level to student and supporting them. And how do they do that? And we create those cases so that way they have the proactive outreach. And in particular, we'll actually go over our not registered case, which essentially, if the student is not registered for their upcoming session, it essentially creates the case for the coach to then create the outreach to the student to kind of walk them through the process on, hey, let's get you an academic advising appointment. Let's find out what your plans are, what your goals are for the next session or next semester. So that way you are registered for those, because the big game plan is retention with success coaching, is keeping them retained, enrolled, so that way they can proceed towards graduation. They support different segmentation types, such as the undergrad, graduate population, military, Starbucks, other corporate partners, Uber, and whatnot, pretty much all of ASU online success students. So every online student gets a success coach regardless. Once they register for their first credit-bearing course, then they're assigned a success coach, and then we assign essentially cases to them based on different outreach or different instances throughout their life cycle. How do we do that? We actually accomplish that through Alteryx, which we use the Amazon Redshift and the data warehouse to query out all this data on figuring out who is not registered, which are these students who are not registered for the next session. We create different SQLs through dbeaver, and we then transform that data into Alteryx, which talks to Salesforce back and forth on how to create those cases. What do we want those cases to be? We create different things so that way they can look a certain way in terms of what the subject is, what the description is, and we load that data into Salesforce so that way the coach has a view. And we'll actually go a little more deeper on to actually what that looks like in terms of how those cases are created, what things are needed. So that way, if you want to do it, you have those tools needed to do that. And this is, if you ever used Alteryx before, this is the big red X. And actually, this was part of our old process. That we have about 30 different types of case type triggers or instances, not registered being one of them, difficult course, new student welcomes, all different types. And this was the old process, and we decided to change it just for many different reasons in terms of we needed a better process, and we wanted to identify what different students, what different cases are needed, so that way that process can run faster, because we all know technology can break. And as we know, last week in the data warehouse, things didn't go as planned and it didn't work. So we had to figure out different things in order to still get those cases created in order for those coaches to have outreach to students. So this actually prompted us to create our new process. We actually created them with different macros for each individual type of case or different type of instances. And we prompted us because of, if one of them breaks in the old process, they all break. And that's not really ideal to have cases that way or have outreach, because if one breaks, then no coach is going to have a case. And then essentially they can't do their jobs. And that's not really good, because then that decreases retention, or those students are not getting supported in some type of way. And again, the students are really the driving force to the success coaches. So we created a new process with a bigger macros, and actually Chuck will go deeper into one specific macro with the not registered.
Thank you, Macho. So this is inside one of the macros for one of our case triggers. We've been through a lot of renditions. We've tried a lot of different ways to create cases in Enterprise Salesforce for our coaches. 6.5 years ago, we had a process that ran out of DBAMP. It was its own server. We had to create the case logic in SQL and then send the ticket to UTO at the time, and then they would implement it. So like a week later, the new change would come in. And if we did something wrong, it would take about a week before we could get it fixed. So it wasn't necessarily great for us, because I'm mistake prone. In the process of that, we tried uploading cases using Excel, which is a very manual process. That's last resort only. And then you saw a workflow with the big X on it earlier. That was great 2 years ago, but we have about 100 stakeholders that are telling us how they want these cases made. So over the last 2 years, there's a lot of Band-Aids on that. And if one little thing breaks, Macho mentioned, the whole thing breaks. And then we have 100 people telling us it didn't work. And we don't like that very much. So this is the new process. Every one of the macros you saw on the previous slide, it's its own individual trigger. So if one doesn't work, we can just, or let's say we need to make a tweak on one, we're only changing one part of it. We're not changing the whole thing. We really like this method. So taking a look at it real quick, on the left-hand side, we've got our 3 inputs. The big one is the Redshift on top. That's where we do the SQL to query the data warehouse and figure out, in this case, which students are not registered for the next session. It populates these cases 6 weeks before the start of the session. And then the other 2 inputs, these are Salesforce inputs. And what we like about these, as opposed to the data warehouse, where the data is refreshed once a day, and let's say it's later in the day and we want to make a tweak, all it has is cases that were created up to that day. So if we had created cases earlier in the day, it wouldn't reflect them, and it could cause potential duplicate cases being created. So to prevent duplicate cases, we've got these 2 Salesforce tools. One of them is to the case object. So that way we can query cases, any cases that were created today, or any changes to cases that coaches might have made during the day, so we don't overwrite the work that they did earlier. So the middle one, that's the case. And then the bottom one, actually, it's part of our online success coach portal. It's we've got all the details for each case type that we want to create, including the different ID fields, the case category, functional group, etc. but it also has an important field called active. And what this does is we can, within the Salesforce itself, we can deactivate cases they don't create. So if something were to happen to Macho and I, and the cases went crazy, Salesforce admins or other Coach Portal admins can go ahead and actually deactivate the case, and it would stop populating this. So it's a good fail-safe in that regard. So we're going to get into the SQL in a little bit, just how that's formatted and consistent with all the other cases. But for this one, because we want not registered to populate only between 6 weeks before the session starts and the session start, we've got this run control tool, which is just a filter based on what day it is. So if it falls within that range, it'll be true. So the data will move through it. If not, it'll be false. We won't create any cases. And then the next part, duplicate existing case check. So this is where we look to see, are there already cases created for this student for not registered? And do we want to create another one? And the answer is always no. We don't want to create another one. In past renditions, there's been times, going back to the first case process I talked about, where we were using DBAMP. A bug got into the code and we were creating 6,000 duplicate cases every day for about 2 weeks until we could get it fixed. So I'm sensitive to this. So we've got a few processes that stop case duplication. So basically what this does is we join on existing cases, and if one exists, then we don't move it through the workflow. So we come out of the top output there. And then the next join, this is where we join in the case details I talked about earlier from that bottom input, the subject, the case categories, functional group, et cetera. All of the things that enterprise Salesforce needs to know in order to create the case for the student, the standard fields. All right, we've got this formula tool right in the middle. And this is actually how we decide who should be the owner of the case. So we've got, roughly 100 success coaches. There's coaches coming in, coaches going out. So we do have, let's say the coach is on leave. We put that coach's students in a coverage basis where another coach will cover for them. So instead of assigning the case to the coach that's actually assigned the student, we have to assign it to the coverage coach. So this formula tool works to make that happen. There's 3 possibilities here. One, it goes to the coverage coach. Another, if it's more important, it'll go to a case queue where the coach's lead will determine who gets the case. And then the third one is, if it's really not that important and time could be better spent elsewhere, we suppress cases if the student actually has a coverage coach. So that's what that formula tool does. The next tool here, it's a filter tool. It basically says, should this case be suppressed? If true, then it goes off into nothing. And if false, then it goes through the workflow, where we do another duplicate check, which this one is there for some reason the SQL output created two cases for the same student. This happens periodically. So this is just a quick check to make sure we don't create 2 of the same case. And then the top part goes up to our Salesforce output tool, where it inserts the case. The second output tool is for our own records, just to have a record of the cases we're creating that day. And then the bottom tool goes to AUDB database, where we use it for testing. So in production, this bottom container is closed, but when we're testing, that one's open and the other one's closed. So that, in a nutshell, is how this Alteryx workflow flows. Yeah, a great question is, will the suppressed cases be suppressed forever, or is there a way to populate them later? And that is a good question. So a lot of these cases are timely, like the not registered we're looking at. If we hit the session starting, we don't want that to populate later. But if that student is assigned a new coach or is no longer assigned to a coach that needs coverage, then that case will populate at that point. So it'll be considered just a normal coach's case, and on that day it'll populate. So this SQL, which we're about to get into, it'll run every day for that 6-week period. And depending on the situation for that day, it'll determine who gets the case. Yeah, so the SQL, we're trying to create consistency in all our Alteryx macros for each case, just to make it simple. So we do the same thing with the SQL, where each case has a very similar flow to it. So we start out with those few fields just to indicate at the top what case it is not registered, what we remove, how we look for uniqueness to remove duplicates, and what database it's coming from. So this is just when I have 50 windows open in dbeaver, I know which one I'm looking at. And you don't need to read through all this, and I'm not going to read through all this. But basically, in a nutshell, this is the piece of code. It's a common table expression that just links who the student is, who the coach is assigned, and if there is a coverage coach, who is that coverage coach. And it does one other thing, which is we support the Navy Community College students, and they've requested that we indicate on each case if they're part of the Navy Community College. And we've got a part in here just to identify those. So it's just kind of the basic, these are the students we're working with and who owns them. Being that it's not registered, there's a few things that coaches like to know before they call the student. So this information is going to go into the description, and it's when was the last time the student was enrolled in classes. So that way the success coach knows what they're dealing with and how long it's been, and gives them some talking points when they're speaking with the student. And then this is kind of a big thing that brings it all together. I think the last one I didn't see got switched, but that was who's enrolled in the session. Because what we do is we don't query who's not enrolled, because that's really hard to do. We query who is enrolled in the session, and then we just remove those students out of the final outflow. So this is where we bring it all together. This top part of the query, that's all of the coach information and the coverage information and who the student is. And then the second part, and this is the same for all of our triggers, all our cases, we've got not registered as the subject _ C, which is an enterprise Salesforce custom field. What we use that for is when we're removing duplicates, we check based on this basic subject. And we do that because when we're done with this case, if let's say there's coverage, we're going to take the subject not registered and we're going to add on that it's coverage. So it'll be not registered coverage to alert the success coach that this is not one of their students, it's one they're covering for. And Navy Community College, if it's one of those, we're going to add on also that is part of the Navy Community College. So it could be not registered coverage NCC. And when we remove duplicates, create uniqueness with these, we want to make sure that the subject is matching correctly. So we have a special field here that's just the basic not registered, so we know what case it is. And then we go into the description. In this case, it's when was the last time the student was registered? And then a few standard fields. We've got term, session, course code. We don't use these for all of our cases. Some of them are more appropriate than others. Like in this case, we wouldn't use course code because it's not a case about a particular course. And then the rest of it is just really filtering down and narrowing down to the population of students we want to create these cases for. And then lastly, this is standard, every case has it, because it's how we determine what the output fields are going into the Alteryx workflow. So it's got all the information we need to create this case. With one important part at the bottom, we're querying the case table. And I know I talk about duplication a lot. Like I said, I've been burned by this, and it's my pet peeve. But we then query the case table and make sure we're not creating cases that have already been created, because I don't want 100 people telling me. So in a nutshell, that's the SQL we just looked at. We run that, the results go through this workflow, and then creates the cases. And right now it's taking us under 10 minutes to run the whole thing with all 30 cases and populate the cases. So in our old process, one of our triggers took about 25 minutes to run on its own. So a big improvement here, and I'm really happy with it.
And as you said, there's certain fields that are needed in order to go into Salesforce, because if it's not part of the object within Salesforce is going to say it's not part of the member field. So some of these fields, like the category, functional group, which that is specifically to the ASU coach outreach. The priority, we created an origin that it's coming in from Alteryx. That's how those cases were created. We create all the case statuses in a new status. So that way the coach is alerted that, hey, you have a new case, that it's in a new status, and then they can switch into different statuses based on different pick list fields. Create a date, stamp, time, the subject on what it is, and the term as well. So that way they're alerted that it is for this specific term. We've also kind of created some uniqueness in terms of, hey, it's not registered for fall A or for fall B. So that way they can prioritize. And the same goes along with other subjects, let's say like their new student welcomes, that it's a new student, that it goes for the fall or for the spring. That way they can prioritize their case a little bit better. And essentially, when all the cases are created, this is the coach view within the Salesforce coach portal for their outreach, where it has essentially all the different types of triggers or case instances that they have, and they can prioritize their day within this, or within Salesforce, there's also a case view list, and they can prioritize that way as well. And when you go within a case, this is essentially what the coach sees within that case in itself, where it has the student's contact information, the case record owner, essentially who that case belongs to, essentially which success coach that belongs to. Then it has the case status, and that can switch depending on their given outreach attempts or what is needed for that specific case type. And then it has the subject and the description at the bottom as well, which this one is the not registered 6 weeks, summer B 2022. So again, so that way they can prioritize their case types a little bit better. Correct. That is in Salesforce view. Yes.
So let's say this is something you'd want to do. You'd want to create cases in Salesforce. I highly recommend this process. It's the best one that we've come up with so far. And we'd be happy to help you do that. A few things you'd want to do is you'd want to get in contact with the Enterprise Salesforce administration team. They've been very helpful in getting us credentials for our Alteryx tools and just giving us guidance on what works for them and some best practices for us. Gather requirements. What exactly is it that you want to create cases for? What's the purpose? And then once you do that, submit a new development request. And this lets the entire all of the groups that use Enterprise Salesforce know what you're doing. And it's just a check to get some feedback and make sure that it's not going to conflict with maybe some other things that other units are doing. And then Slack Macho and I, because we love to help and we love to share what we're working on. And if you can get through without all the growing pains we had, I think that's a win for our students. So with that, that's a good question. The question was, besides not registered, what are some other uses? Macho, can you go back to the slide with all of our cases? So here's some of them. Basically, it's, what could cause a student to potentially not be registered in classes or not be academically successful. So, we have a process where we run all the courses that the students take, and we determine if 70% or fewer, 70% or less of the class is successful in it, either it results in withdrawal or a failing grade, we'll classify those as difficult courses and create a case for the coach to reach out to the student just to give them a heads up with any tutoring that's available, or just let them know, hey, this course might be tougher than what you might think, so pay attention to it. Another example is with the Plus Alliance. Some students attend classes in a platform not run by ASU, so it's a little bit different. And we just want to give the student a heads up that, the process can be a little bit different with that. Macho.
And other times, as I mentioned, like with a new student welcome. So when a student is assigned to a coach, that creates a case for the coach to essentially establish that first connection with them, to let them know, hey, I'm here for you. I'm here to support you throughout the life cycle as your coach. So that way you can essentially get retained and continue on, so you can graduate and you can move on to the next steps. Which then, if they apply for graduation, then it creates a trigger for them as well. Hey, I've applied for graduation. or if they've graduated, just that way they can get them to the resources and support. So that way they can feel supported and they can feel connected. Because that's really the one big thing for ASU online students is they're not on campus. They're online, they're at home, wherever they are, and they still want to feel connected to ASU and still feel part of the community in itself.
Yeah, I would say on average, we make between 2,000 and 5,000 cases a day.
That's about it. But again, if you want to create cases for your own units, we're gladly to help you, give you samples or whatever that looks like, and making sure that you're all set up with what you need in order to create cases for your department and what makes sense for you.
Thanks for coming.